Hey guys, and welcome to the 11th and final episode of this inventory series. Today we're going to be working on the final part of our item inspector, where we'll be adding the statistics of our item into our actual inventory panel. Let's get started. Now, when we made our inventory panel all the way back in episode number 1, we have added these statistics to our item inspector. Back in the day, I've added them for a sort of visual impression on what we can expect at the end of this series, but now they're no longer really useful because, well, we can have like dozens of different stats right in our game. We could have the basic statistics that we have right now, but once you get into magical equipment with all the magical properties like fire damage, ice damage, poison damage, arcane damage, you name it, damage, you can think of so many different things to put in there. So instead of defining several dozen of different stats down below here, it's actually much easier to add these stats sort of on the go. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So I've already emptied all the stats from container 1, from item inspector number 1. And here in item inspector number 2, basically what I did already was I've right-clicked one of these boxes and I've saved that branch as a scene by itself. Thereby, I now have a stat scene, which I renamed to just say stat number 1, and I've emptied both the name and the value. But by saving the branch like that, you're saving all the settings which we had when we made the user interface panel back in episode 1, and we now got that in a separate scene, which we will be able to add as childs to this inventory panel in code. So also for inspector number 2, I'm going to be deleting all of these. And with that done, we can get on to the next step. Now we need to be adding that stat scene we've just defined as a child of the specific item inspector that needs to be loaded. And we need to be adding that child several times over for every stat that we need to add. So to do that, we're going to go to the script within our inventory panel. And within that script, we already have a load inspector 1 and a load inspector 2 function from the last episode in which we have written the state machine for this. Now it's already loading the icon and it's loading the item name, but we want that to load the stats as well. And we want both of these, inspector 1 and 2, we want them to load the stats. And to have them both load the stats, it means that it's actually easy to just define a new function. So we're going to be defining this part over here. And the first one, inspector stats, is going to be the actual inspector which needs to be used by the function load item stats. So we'll put that function down below here. And we'll copy paste this underneath load inspector number 2. And we're going to be changing this to inspector 2 stats. Now, of course, this is still giving an error, because we have not defined this variable yet. But the idea is that if inspector 1 calls load item stats, then the inspector stats is going to be equal to the inspector 1 stats node. And if inspector 2 calls load item stats, we set the inspector stats node to equal to inspector 2 stats. So with that way, we have a variable inspector stats, which we're going to be equalizing to a node reference, namely the stats node here and the stats node there, each under inspector number 2 and inspector number 1. And by setting that variable, we'll be able to put the new scenes, or all our stat scenes that we have right here, we'll be able to put them in the right location within the tree, either inspector 1 and 2, depending on where it needs to go. So with that said, we first need to be defining this inspector stats. And we're going to be doing that right on top here. And at the beginning of the script, we'll set that to null. And after that, we'll also be needing to identify the reference to that node. And just like we've did that previously on the top here, let's put them down below on this side. So we have inspector 1 and 2. And we're also going to be defining this whenever the script is finished loading. So these are get nodes, both of them, and the node expects a text. And for inspector number 1, we're gonna copy the path paste it in here. And for inspector number 2, we're going to be copying the path and paste it in there. So now we have a variable inspector2 stats, which is a node reference, and inspector1 stats, which is a node reference. And we have the variable inspector stats. So this inspector stats is either going to be a copy of inspector1 stats or inspector2 stats, and that happens right underneath here in the load inspector. So in inspector1, we set the inspector stats equal to inspector1, and in load inspector2, we set the inspector stats equal to inspector2 stats. And then within our load item stats function, we can use that variable to reference the correct node. So now we have a variable within our code to know where we have to put it. The next thing is, what do we have to put there and how many? So for that, I'm going to go back to our actual item table that we have defined back in episode 2 and that we have imported into Godot using a JSON import. So we're compiling this to JSON, then putting it into Godot. And in here we have our items. For example, the steel sword that we currently have within our inventory. And in here we have access to all the different statistics. So we have an attack value, we have a defense value, but that's 0. We have a weight, and we have a durability. And we want to see those statistics within our item inspector so we can actually compare 2 different weapons and see which one is better. So we need to be accessing this. And basically on the top here, these are the names of our statistics that we want to show. So this is what we want to get. In order to get there, we're going to be accessing the dictionary. Oh, this is the wrong screen. We're going to be accessing the dictionary based on that JSON, and we're going to be retrieving all the column names of the spreadsheet, which are now the dictionary keys within that specific weapon. So let's do that now. Now, to retrieve those column headings, which is equal to our names of our statistics, we're first going to be defining the item name. We'll be needing it several times in this function. And that is, of course, our inventory data inventory slot, with the inventory slot being passed into this function by the inspector. Then we're going to be retrieving the names of the statistics, so item attack, item defense, etc., by then referencing the item data, so not the inventory data, but the item data. We look up the item name and retrieve the keys. And what that actually is doing is, when we take the item data JSON that is compiled from our spreadsheet, it's looking up, for example, here steel sword, and it's gonna be retrieving all the keys of steel sword, which are item name, item attack, item defense, item weight, and item durability. So with that said, we can go back to our code and we can wonder, do we want all of those stats? Well, no, we don't, because the item name is already on the heading of the inspector, and the item type is not really that interesting to the player. First of all, it will probably know that a sword is part of the class weapons, and already we have our different categories within our inventory, so he won't even be able to select the weapons when he's in the armor category. So we don't really need the item name and item type, so we'll be erasing those from the array we have created on the stat names. So they're no longer available. After that, we can iterate over this list and add them one by one. Now, to add the actual stat as a node to our node tree, we're going to be iterating over every stat in stat names. So that's the array we just defined. And then first, we're going to be verifying if that stat is something else than 0. The reason why we do that is that, for example, for our sword, it has a defense of 0, but defense is not really a statistic we're that interested in as a player. And we don't want to be loading up 32 different stats like fire damage 0, ice damage 0, arcane damage 0. That's not of interest to the player. We're only burdening him with useless information. So we are taking out every single stat which is 0, and for those that are not 0, we're going to be defining our stat node. So that is the scene that we have created as a separate branch. We're loading that one up as an instance, and then the inspector stats. So that is the inspector stats we have defined as number 2 or number 1 up here in the code. We add the child to it, the stat node, and we set an extra variable true here, a boolean. And what this does, it will give, as the documentation says itself, human names to your nodes. That means that for now we have, for example, stat1 is right here, but a node needs to have a unique name. So it will automatically create stat2, stat3, stat4, stat5, stat6. If you wouldn't set true here, you're going to have names with different kind of symbols, underscores, exclamation marks, like Godot can do something by itself. And we might want to be using the reference in the future, and then it's handy when it has a human name. So with this done, we have added our child to the inspector, but now we need to make adjustments to the child. Now we need to be setting the label of stat name and the label of stat value to the actual statistics that we want to be importing. However, we currently have loaded this child, but we can't access it. In order to do that, we're going to be using a child index of the parent. So let's code that now. I'll show you what I mean. We start off by defining a counter, a variable, new variable counter, and we set the value to 0 because we're going to be retrieving an array of children in this next piece of code. What we do right here is we set a new variable, the current stat. So that's the current node that we want to be adjusting, or the current child that we've just recently added, you could say in more human language. Then we get the inspector stats, so that is within our inventory, the stats horizontal box or vertical box right there, and we get the child with that specific counter. So all the children form an array of children, and with the function getChildCounter you can get the array, the specific child based on the index of which it is from top to bottom. So we know that our first child will be added as index number 0 and our second child will be added as index number 1. And that's what this counter is for. We start at 0 and then with every node that we add 1 to the counter. Thereby we can iterate over these children very easily and retrieve their information. Then we get to know to that path of current stat that we defined up there. You can see those are the same. We go into stat name, which is the stat name, and the stat value. You can see that here. And we set the text to stat because that's what's inside right there. That's the name that we have retrieved out of stat names. And we're going to set the value. And then we go back into our item data. We go to the item name and we take the key stat, because not only is it a name for the stat, it's also the dictionary key which holds the value for it. So with this we should have a reasonable functional inventory inspector that will allow us to see some of those statistics. There we go. We now have our item attack, our item weight, and our item durability. But as you can see, this doesn't look that great. 175 right there is cut off, it's clipped. And you know, the player doesn't really need to know item attack and item weight and item durability. Just attack, weight, and durability will be fine. We might even want to shorten that down further to like common abbreviations like ATT for attack. Weight can stay the same, and durability just dura. So we're going to be doing that up in the next part. Now there's two ways you can do this, and I've chosen for this tutorial to take the easy route because I entrust that you can do it the more difficult and more comprehensive route yourself. The best way to probably do it is to define the short name for that statistics within the item table. That would be the most easy, and then you're just referencing the same table all the time. In our case, the easy route, and especially when you're making a smaller game, is probably a little bit faster, is to define a new dictionary up here. So I've made a new variable, short of stats names, or actually maybe replace the stat names. Anyway, it's going to take the item attack and turn it into attack. It's going to take the item defense into def, item weight just into weight, item durability in just dura. And then instead of taking the stat, let's copy paste that name, that will be easy. So we take that variable and we're going to put it down here. So the stat name is going to be accessing that dictionary, is going to take the key stat and it will retrieve that shorter name. Now when we press play and we hit our inventory, our items our statistic names are nice and short, and the way we have set up the node, now our variables are nicely lined out in a nice vertical line. We already had set that up in episode 1, so if you're struggling there, if you want to know how we did that, make sure you check out episode number 1 where we actually built this UI panel. So with that done, we still have an issue, because if now I go for a steel boots, you can see that there starts to become a scroll button here. And if I go to weapons again and to boots, you see this is getting longer and longer. And that's because we are not erasing existing stat nodes when we press a new button. So we got to make sure that those nodes that we have just added are deleted the moment we press a new item. And when we got that finished, we're pretty much done with the series. So let's get into that. To delete those nodes, we can make use of the functions empty inspector 1 and empty inspector 2. We're already emptying the name and the texture, just like we were adding name and texture icon on these two functions. So let's use these functions and add a little bit of code. It's quite easy. First, we define a new variable childs, and we get inspector 1 stats get all the children. So that will retrieve an array of nodes. Then for every node in childs, we simply remove that child from the inspector 1 stats. And we can do exactly the same for inspector number 2, where we of course take inspector number 2 instead of inspector number 1. Now we're almost there, because right now we are calling in our state machine empty inspector number 2 whenever that's necessary for our compare functionality, but we're never emptying inspector number 1, because the item icon and the item name could simply be overwritten whenever another inspector 1 was loaded. We currently only call inspector number 1 in our trash bin code, where we have to delete that item altogether. So right now we want to make sure that those that inspector 1 is emptied when we press the button again, to make sure that those nodes are deleted. So we have to empty inspector 1 before we load inspector 1 when 1 is already loaded, when a single compare is loaded. And whenever a double compare is loaded, the item inspector 1 is loaded again, but we need to empty that one too. So on these two locations, we need to be calling that empty function to delete those nodes at the right time. With that done, we can open our inventory. We have a steel sword, and when you press boots, you see there's no long line of scroll containers starting, because those nodes are deleted. And I can do the same when I go to compare, the way we've set it up. Also, the items are loaded into here, and we can compare two different boots if we want to. We can disable compare and continue with checking out items. So that is a fully functional inventory system. And I think that the things that we have been teaching in this inventory series and that you have been learning can be applied to many different styles of inventory systems. So if you feel like, okay, this is not the user interface that I'm looking for, and not the exact functionality that you're looking for, like also with drag and drop, you can code a lot of things. So yeah, I wish you good luck with your inventory series, or your own inventory, I should say, in your own game. And I hope that this tutorial series has been helpful. Now, just before we leave, we're going to optimize that code a little bit. And yeah, if you want to stick around for that, then just wait for the next part. So that optimization, if you're still here, is basically, where was it? Right here, we are defining the item name as our input inventory data inventory slot. But that same piece of code is also here and it's also there. And the only reason why we have to input inventory slot on the load item stats is to retrieve that item name yet again. We don't need it anywhere else. Like here we're already using item name, and here we're using item name. So to make this code a little bit more efficient, we can define this variable up on the top here and up on the top here. And instead of inventory slot, we can put in the item name to our load item stats, and we can set the load item stats to expect the item name. Now we no longer have to define the item name here, so we can remove that piece of code. So that's one small optimization, but at the same time we can use item name and replace this dictionary lookup. We can replace this dictionary lookup, and we can replace, oh, not that one, that's actually defining the item name, this dictionary lookup, and we can replace this dictionary lookup. Not only do we reduce the amount of dictionary lookups that the code needs to be doing, but also we're making our code more readable by saying item name instead of import data, inventory slot, index 0. Like, item name is considerably more readable in your code, and when we made these changes, nothing really happened in terms of the functionality of our code. This is all functional as we had just demonstrated. So nothing changed, we've just optimized our code a little bit as I said that we would. With that done, this tutorial series is over. So that's it, guys. That is 11 episodes inventory series done. I hope you like this, and I hope that you learned a lot and that you can code your own inventory systems and item systems going forward, coding in Godot. If you like this episode or the series altogether, please smash that like button and hit subscribe to not miss out on the next series that I'm going to be starting from Friday, which is going to be about combat and all kinds of different combat mechanics within Godot. From HP bars to how you make projectiles detect impact, how to reduce health on both your own player and the monsters you're trying to kill. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be uploading next Friday, so hit that subscribe button, hit that bell icon, and put your notifications on so you don't miss it. And as always, I stream every Tuesday and Thursday, so if you got any other questions about Godot, game development, maybe tips and tricks, or if you just want to see what I'm doing in terms of my personal game development, then please join me on my Twitch channel. The link in the descriptions and the schedule for when I'm actually online are down below in the description. Hope you like this, and I hope to see you in my combat series. I'll see you then. Bye bye.